Frederick Douglass escaped slavery, rewrote American history, and became the most photographed man of the 19th century. But the man who demanded the world see him clearly never knew who he truly was. His father's identity was hidden by design, and his African origins were erased by the machinery of slavery. When DNA science finally reached his descendants, what it found was extraordinary, and one part of it no one saw coming. Before we dive in, comment where you are watching from and click subscribe. Frederick Douglass was born into a system designed to make him forgettable. The year was approximately 1818, the place Talbot County on Maryland's eastern shore, and the circumstances were those of American slavery in its full, deliberate brutality. He was given no birth record. No age was confirmed to him. His mother, Harriet Bailey, was taken from him before he was old enough to hold her face in memory, hired out to a farm 12 miles away, allowed to visit only at night, and dead before he turned 10. He grew up not knowing the year of his own birth, a detail most people absorb without thinking, the kind of knowledge passed quietly from parent to child as a matter of course. For Douglass, it was simply absent. He would later write about this absence with a precision that made it more devastating than any outrage could. In his 1845 narrative, he observed that slaveholders had a practice of keeping their slaves ignorant of their ages, that a master who allowed his slave to inquire into their age was exceptional. He did not know his birthday. He had heard a rumor about the year, that was all. The loss was not accidental. Slavery in the antebellum South operated, in part, through the deliberate destruction of identity. Surnames were stripped away or assigned arbitrarily. Family units were broken by sale. Languages brought from Africa faded within a generation. The knowledge of where a person came from, who their parents were, what people they belonged to, was treated as unnecessary information for those classified as property. The system did not merely exploit the body, it unmade the self. Douglass survived it, escaped it, and built himself into one of the most powerful voices in American history. He became a writer, an orator, an advisor to presidents, the most photographed man of his century. He constructed an identity of extraordinary force and clarity out of the wreckage of what had been taken. But what slavery had erased, he could not recover alone. His father's name, his African origins, the full human record of where he came from, those answers would require a kind of evidence that did not yet exist. Of all the silence slavery imposed on Frederick Douglass, none was more deliberate than the one surrounding his father. He knew the absence had a shape. In his first autobiography, published in 1845, he named it directly. The identity of his father, he wrote, was shrouded in mystery. He had heard whispers. The whispers pointed toward a white man. The white man most often named was Aaron Anthony, the man who legally owned him. Anthony was not a peripheral figure. He was the overseer of a large plantation network on Maryland's eastern shore, a man of local authority who had daily access to the enslaved people under his control. The timeline was uncomfortable but coherent. Douglass's mother, Harriet Bailey, was one of Anthony's enslaved workers. The approximate dates of Douglass's birth aligned with a period when Anthony would have had regular proximity to her. The circumstantial case was not fabricated. It was assembled from the architecture of the system itself, a system in which enslaved women had no legal protection from the men who owned them. Douglass did not accuse Anthony by name with certainty, but across his three autobiographies, written in 1845, 1855, and 1881, his language shifted. The early uncertainty became, over time, a pointed implication. By the 1855 version, he wrote that his father was a white man and that the whisper was nearly universal. He stopped short of a direct accusation, but the direction of his words was unmistakable. Historians who followed added complications. Some examined the records and argued that Thomas Old, Anthony's son-in-law, was a more plausible candidate based on proximity and timeline. Others pointed back to Anthony. The debate never produced a consensus. Every argument rested on circumstantial evidence, on timelines and proximity and the logic of a brutal system, but on nothing that could be confirmed. What made the question more than biographical was what it implied. If Douglass's father was his enslaver, then the man who created him also owned him, and the entire arc of Douglass's life, his escape, his defiance, his brilliance, unfolded in direct opposition to the man responsible for his existence. That contradiction sat at the center of his story, unresolved, for more than 150 years. Frederick Douglass's missing ancestry was not an isolated wound. It was a condition shared by millions, and understanding why requires looking at what American slavery did to human memory on an institutional scale. When enslaved people were brought to the Chesapeake region, they arrived carrying languages, family structures, spiritual practices, and the knowledge of where they came from. Within a generation, most of that knowledge was gone, not because people forgot, but because the system was designed to make transmission impossible. Children were sold away from parents, and families were divided across state lines. The African languages that might have carried identity forward were suppressed or simply had no one left to speak them. What remained were fragments, names that sounded like corrupted versions of something older, stories that had lost their geography, a sense of origin with no address attached. The documentary record did nothing to help. In the ledgers of American slavery, enslaved people appeared as entries, listed by first name, age estimate, and monetary value. No birthplaces, no parents, no lineage. The records that exist were designed to account for property, not people. For genealogists working on Black American family histories, this creates what researchers now call the brick wall, the point at which conventional records simply end, usually somewhere between 1860 and 1870, at the threshold of emancipation, beyond which the paper trail collapses into silence. Douglass himself hit that wall. He could reconstruct parts of his own story through memory and testimony, but the deeper lines, his mother's origins, his grandmother's people, the African roots that preceded the Atlantic crossing, were beyond any document he could access. He wrote with longing about a people and a continent he had never been able to proclaim with certainty. The connection was felt but unprovable. The evidence did not exist in any archive. For more than a century after his death, the situation did not improve. Genealogists traced what they could. Historians documented what the record allowed. But the origins that slavery had erased stayed erased. No amount of archival skill could cross the wall that had been deliberately built. That changed when a different kind of evidence became available, one that did not depend on records anyone had bothered to keep. The tool that changed everything was not found in an archive. It was found in a cell. By the early years of the 21st century, genetic genealogy had matured enough to offer something documentary research never could: biological evidence of ancestry that existed independently of any record a slaveholder had chosen to keep or destroy. DNA does not require paperwork. It does not need a census entry or a plantation ledger. It carries its information forward through generations regardless of what any human institution decided to preserve or erase. The investigation into Frederick Douglass's ancestry drew on two distinct forms of genetic analysis, each designed to answer a different question. The first was mitochondrial DNA, the same tool used to trace Abraham Lincoln's maternal line, passed exclusively from mother to child, unchanged through generations. It offered a way to follow Douglass's maternal ancestry backward through his mother Harriet Bailey, through her mother, and further, potentially across the Atlantic itself. The second was Y chromosome DNA, passed from father to son in an unbroken male line. This was the tool aimed directly at the question that had resisted every other form of investigation for more than 150 years. The challenge was finding the right participants. Abraham Lincoln's maternal line had run through surviving female descendants. Douglass's case required a different approach. Researchers identified living male descendants carrying an unbroken patrilineal connection to Douglass himself, men who had inherited his Y chromosome through an uninterrupted line of fathers and sons. For the maternal line, They identified descendants carrying the mitochondrial signature passed down through Douglass's mother's lineage. Locating these individuals required its own investigation, working through genealogical records, family trees, and the documented history of Douglass's children and grandchildren. Each participant provided a DNA sample. The samples were sequenced and analyzed, the results mapped against global genetic databases containing hundreds of thousands of reference profiles from populations across Africa, Europe, the Americas, and beyond. The methodology was the same one now used to answer ancestry questions for millions of people worldwide. What made this application different was what was at stake. For Douglass's descendants, this was not a curiosity exercise. It was the first real chance to recover something that had been taken by force. The results were waiting. The mitochondrial results came back pointing to West Africa, not vaguely, not as a broad continental suggestion, but with the specificity that modern haplogroup analysis makes possible. The maternal line traced to a genetic signature concentrated in the region spanning present-day Nigeria, Cameroon, and the surrounding areas of West and Central Africa. It was the same broad corridor from which the majority of enslaved people brought to the Chesapeake region had been taken during the height of the Atlantic slave trade. The finding was not coincidental. Maryland's enslaved population in the 18th and early 19th centuries drew heavily from specific West and Central African regions, particularly through the trade networks that fed into the ports of Annapolis and Baltimore. The genetic signature matched the historical pattern with a precision that no document had ever been able to establish. Harriet Bailey's maternal line, and through her, Douglass's own maternal origin, reached back to a people and a place that slavery had spent generations trying to make unreachable. For a man who had written about Africa with longing and uncertainty, who had spoken of his people without being able to name them geographically, the finding carried a weight that went beyond genealogy. Douglass had described his mother in fragments: a face glimpsed at night, a presence felt rather than known, a woman who walked 12 miles in darkness to sit with her child for an hour before walking back. She had been reduced by the system to an outline. The DNA returned something of what had been taken: her origins, her people, the line she carried from a continent that slavery had tried to make permanently foreign to her descendants. The result also confirmed something historians had long suspected, but never been able to prove with certainty. Douglass's maternal ancestry placed him squarely within the demographic pattern of the Chesapeake slave trade, a pattern shaped by specific African ethnic groups, specific trade routes, and specific regional origins. Science was connecting individual identity to collective history in a way that archives simply could not. One line of his ancestry was now recovered. The other, the one that had carried the heaviest silence, was still waiting for its answer. The Y chromosome results told a different story. Where the maternal line had reached back to West Africa with clarity, the paternal line pointed in another direction entirely. The genetic signature carried in the Y chromosome of Douglass's male descendants traced not to Africa but to the British Isles. The haplogroup was consistent with ancestry from England, Scotland, or Ireland, populations that had settled the colonial Chesapeake in large numbers across the 17th and 18th centuries. The result was not ambiguous. The paternal line was European. The finding did not name a man. Y chromosome DNA identifies ancestral populations, not individuals. It could confirm the geographic and ethnic origin of the paternal line with reasonable precision, but it could not reach into the records of Talbot County, Maryland, pull out a name, and place it next to Douglass's. Aaron Anthony remained a plausible candidate. Thomas Auld remained a plausible candidate. The science had narrowed the field to a population and a historical pattern, but the specific individual who had fathered Frederick Douglass remained, as he always had been, beyond direct confirmation. What the DNA did confirm was the broader historical truth that Douglass himself had spent decades pointing toward. His father was a white man. His father was almost certainly a man with power over him or his mother, operating within a system that made the sexual exploitation of enslaved women not only possible, but structurally protected. The genetic evidence aligned with what Douglass had written, what historians had argued, and what the logic of the system had always implied. The science did not discover something new so much as it removed the last grounds for reasonable doubt. The weight of that confirmation carried its own particular gravity. Douglass had been born of an encounter that the law of his time classified as unremarkable, the child of a white man and the woman he owned. That origin had shaped everything. His separation from his mother, his movement through a series of households, the particular cruelty of a system that could produce a child and then own him. The answer science could give had now been given. The answer only a name could provide remained out of reach. And then the results revealed something no one had expected. The third finding arrived without precedent. Nested within the genetic profile of Douglass's lineage was a marker that pointed not to Africa and not to Europe, but to the indigenous peoples of North America. The ancestry was real, measurable, and traceable to a specific branch of his family tree. It had been carried forward through generations, quiet and unrecorded until the sequencing made it visible. The finding was unexpected, but not historically implausible. The colonial Chesapeake was not a world of cleanly separated populations. Enslaved Africans and indigenous peoples occupied overlapping spaces in the margins of colonial society, brought together by shared dispossession and geographic proximity. In Maryland and Virginia, documented cases of contact, cohabitation, and intermarriage between Black and indigenous communities existed across the 17th and 18th centuries. Entire communities formed at those intersections, communities that colonial record-keeping often ignored or misclassified, recording mixed ancestry individuals under whatever category served administrative convenience. The paper trail was thin by design. For Douglass's lineage, the DNA suggested that at some point along one of his ancestral lines, likely within the colonial or early American period, an indigenous ancestor had entered the family. The precise generation could not be confirmed with certainty. The specific nation or people could not be named from the genetic evidence alone, but the marker was there, consistent and traceable to Native American populations of the Eastern Woodlands region, the same geographic world that Douglass's ancestors had inhabited. What the finding did was reframe Douglass entirely. He had lived and written as a man with two inheritance threads, the African heritage that slavery had tried to erase and the European paternal line that exploitation had imposed. The DNA revealed a third. He was not simply the product of Africa and the colonial British Isles. He carried within him a piece of the continent's original peoples, the communities that had been displaced to make way for the plantation system that then enslaved his maternal ancestors. 3 populations, 3 histories, 3 threads of dispossession, survival, and continuity converging in a single man who had spent his life demanding that America reckon with all of it. Frederick Douglass spent his life constructing an identity from almost nothing, building outward from the wreckage of what slavery had taken. DNA science has now returned part of what was stolen. His maternal line reaches back to West Africa. His paternal line reflects the violence of enslavement. His indigenous ancestry names a third history no record ever acknowledged. His father's identity remains beyond what science can confirm. But the man who once had no origin story now has one, and it belongs in full to America.